Hey guys, Waterfaller41 here, and in today's video we are going to be doing what now will be arguably the largest project on the Raptor and really on any truck I've done in my life. We're going to be replacing the fender with a carbon fiber panel from Extreme Online Stores. So EOS, again, is a sponsor of the channel. We did the lower grille trim, we did the hood, now we're going to do the fenders, and then in the last video of the series we're going to do the fender flares. But for now we're just going to focus on the fenders and the fender grill here. So today's video should be very straightforward. We're going to be pulling off the factory fender and then putting on this new fender. I hope that everything is bolt on. So far, with all of the parts that I've installed by EOS, everything has been bolt on. Very minimal modifications needed, but drilling on the hood, but honestly it wasn't too terrible. I hope these fenders are much the same. Process a little tedious, but I'm going to try to simplify it for you. So when it comes to install, there's a few things you have to do before you can even get the fender flare or the fender itself off. First thing you need to do is obviously pop the hood. Second thing we need to do is remove the shroud over the top, and we're going to have to pull the grill off the truck. Then we're going to remove the headlights, and then from there we're going to remove the inside wheel well liner. And once we do that, we'll be able to get access to all the bolts that are holding the fender on, and it should be popping straight off. The only tricky part of removing the fender itself is there's foam all along here that we're gonna have to cut. The one thing I will say is a huge shout out to Matt and Sean from the Raptor Facebook groups. They did help me get set up with some instructions here. So these are the factory or the OEM service manual removal guides for the parts that we need to remove. I have digital copies, and I will drop them in a share file that's going to be in the description to this video. So if you are tackling this project, or you're just trying to replace the fender on your Raptor with an OEM one, maybe got in an accident or fender bender or whatnot, all of these files will be there. So let's get the truck pulled back into the garage and start diving into removing that grill. All right, so we got the truck in the garage. The first thing we're going to do is go ahead and remove all of these push pins up at the top of this radiator shroud. We need to pull this guy off. That way we can get access to the plugs. And then we're going to unplug the marker lights. We're going to unplug the camera, the windshield or the camera washer fluid. And then I believe there's one other plug in the back here. And then we're going to pull everything up. But let's get the radiator shroud off, and I'll show you what we're working with. All right, so once we have the radiator shroud off, you can get access to all the plugs. So we're going to unplug the marker lights here. This is the active shutters for behind the grill. We're going to unplug that guy. And then there's two plugs here. This is for your camera. This is for the windshield washer feed to the camera to keep it clean. We're going to go ahead and undo those. After we unplug those four harnesses, then we're going to turn our attention to this 10mm, that guy, and that guy. So let's go ahead and get these undone and keep going with the project here. All right, so we got everything unplugged up here. All of our harnesses are loose. Top of the grill is unbolted. So everything up here is done for now. Now the next thing we need to do is focus on this lower grill trim. You saw me remove this in the past. It's very easy. What we're going to do is go in the wheel well here, and we're going to undo these 7mm bolts right here. While we're here, we're also going to undo these two, because eventually we're going to have to pull this guy out, and I figure if I'm there already, let's go ahead and get these things pulled out. So once we pull these 7mm bolts out, what we'll be able to do is then pull the fender flare off real quick, and then we'll be able to pull this guy off, because this is just pressed in with pressure. All right, so after you remove those two 7mm bolts holding the fender flare on, all you need to do is just grab at the bottom here and just give it a nice little yank, and it'll pop out. You're just trying to pop these white clips free. You don't need to do the whole fender flare, and since we're replacing the whole fender anyway, I'll deal with these once I get the fender off the truck. So now that we got both fender flares pulled out on the sides here, what I'm going to do is reach underneath here and do the same thing. Just give this guy a nice little tug and then unclip him all the way around. So once this guy's out of the way, we'll get access to those bolts. I'll show you where the bolts are on the bottom of the grill. Then the grill can come out, and then we can focus on removing the headlights. All right, so now that we got that lower grill trim removed, the next thing we're going to want to do is get an 8mm long socket here and undo the inside bolt on each side. So there's two bolts. Just need to get the inside one. So there's one there. We'll go over here, and here's the other one. Once we undo these two bolts, what we're going to do is grab the grill right here and then right here, and just pull it off. It's just clips holding it in at this point. Then once we pull it off, we'll carefully set this guy aside, and then we'll turn our attention to the headlights. All right, so at this point, you should have grill, lower grill, upper shroud completely removed. So now we're on basically phase 2 of the removal process. Now we're gonna focus on the headlights. There are 3 little things you gotta remove up top, 2 bolts and 1 little plastic tab. Then on the side of the headlight down here, there are another 3 bolts right inside here. So once we remove these 3, the 3 on top, the headlight should pull straight out. Then we could unplug everything on the back. So we're going to go ahead and do this, remove the headlights. This is probably the easiest part of the process. Okay, so with the headlights, there were the 2 bolts up on top as well as that push pin, 3 bolts on the side, but there's also 1 bolt up front here That's an 8mm, and then there's another 8mm nut right in there. So once those two are undone, then the whole light can pull off. So you're basically doing 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 bolts, 1 nut, and then this whole guy should pull right off. So let's go ahead and get these guys undone and then get our headlights pulled out. There's going to be a bunch of plugs on the back. I would suggest wearing rubber gloves like this because it makes unplugging those a lot easier. Also, one thing I would suggest doing is start protecting the body panels, because as you pull headlights out, they're kind of clumsy, and you don't want them to hit the corner here, this protruding edge, and mess up any of your paint, because you want to be able to put these back on if you need to. All right, so once our headlights are out of the way, now what we need to do is remove our fender flare. I know in the beginning of the video I said that I was going to leave it on until I get the fenders off, but unfortunately there's a bunch of bolts along there that we need to get access to in order to get the fender off. So it's been pretty easy. I guess the warm weather right now is working in my favor when I'm removing this. So I basically have everything. It's just basically pulling this fender flare off. I got these clips left, so I'm just going to get some rubber gloves. That way I don't scratch the car, and just give it a nice yank, and then this guy should be off. Make sure when you're doing this, though, you do unplug the marker light. It's a very easy plug to forget about and accidentally rip the cord out of here, but the plug's right here on this side, and then on the driver's side, it's in the same exact spot. Okay. So the fender flares came off super easy. I'm actually blown away that I didn't break any of those white clips. But anyway, the next step that we're going to do here is we need to go ahead and remove all of these 8mm bolts all along the edge of the splash guard here. And then inside there's a whole bunch of plastic clips that we're going to go ahead and remove with plastic trim removal tools. At that point, this whole liner should pop straight out. And I like the fact that it attaches here on the edge, which means that when we go to put it back in, it should be pretty easy to put back in. All right, quick stock take as to where we're at. We're still in disassembly phase. We're not exactly to the fenders yet, but we got everything else out of the way, and now we can start working on the fender bolts. But couple words of advice here. The fender liner on the passenger side is super easy to get undone. After you undo all of the bolts along the edge there, there's 3 plastic clips on the inside of the wheel well. Pop it off on the back corner, and then the liner literally just falls down. So the instructions do say in Ford's manual to remove the wheel. You don't need to do that. So you can do everything with the wheel in place. On the driver's side, slightly more complicated, same steps though. Undo the outside bolts here, all along the edge, and then underneath, you got to undo those 3 clips, but also there's a whole bunch of wire harnesses that are popped into the top of the wheel well liner. So when you pull it down, it's not going to fall down like the passenger side because all these harnesses are holding it. So you're going to have a trim tool ready to go, and you're going to pop those guys off. Super easy to get them off, but there is a lot. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There's 7 harnesses that plug into the top of that splash liner. But at this point, everything is undone, and now we can start turning our attention to the fenders. I'm going to go grab a bite to eat real quick, and then we will dive into these guys. And this looks like it's going to be a lot easier than I was imagining. All right, it is a new day. I ran out of daylight, but I didn't stop working. And the reason being is I wanted to finish up one side so that when I film the actual install on the other side, because they're identical, I know what I'm talking about. So last night I went ahead and finished the driver's side. Everything is in. Fenders popped on, or fender flares popped on just enough so I can get that lower grille trim in eventually. Headlights back in. Everything's working. Fitment is amazing. So I learned a lot on this one. So we're going to cover all the steps. And again, the driver's side and passenger side are identical. So the installs are going to be very much the same thing. So back to the passenger side. Let's talk about removing the fender flare, because that's where we're at right now. I'm sorry, removing the fender. So there is a bolt right here that we're going to remove. Then there is a bolt right here behind in the door seam. So if you open up the door, you can see the bolts right there sneaking through. Then we're going to pull up this little trim piece. There's a 10mm bolt right there. That will undo basically the hidden ones. Then we got some bolts along here, 3, 1 there, 1 here, and 1 here. That will undo the top of the fender. When you undo these, leave one of them in place because you're going to essentially want that fender to hang before it falls off the truck. So leave one bolt in loosely. Then inside the wheel well, there is a bolt right here that we're going to undo. Nothing else inside the wheel well. Underneath, there are 2 bolts right there that we're going to undo. So once we undo all of these, most of them are 10mm. I believe this guy is an 8mm. Once we undo all of those, the fender will pop straight off. I know previously in the video I said there's probably foam right along here, and typically there is when you're talking about fenders on a factory truck. But I guess on the Raptors, they didn't include any of that foam there. So it's very easy to pull this thing off. No cutting needed. It's literally unbolt it. It pulls straight off. And because then I could show you where the real work starts, because we're going to have to make some cuts on our EOS fender. to make sure we can accommodate things like our lane departure sensor or accident. I don't know what this really is. I think it's lane departure. And then there's a few other holes that we need to drill on the EOS carbon fiber panel to make sure everything fits. All right, so we have our fenders off and side by side here. So a couple things. One, we're gonna need to remove some hardware. So we're gonna remove this guy as well as this plastic trim panel tool thing. All of this stuff's gonna get swapped over to the new fender. Then there's a couple clips along the fender itself. So one here, I believe there's one inside as well. All of those we'll need to go over. Now, I did say there's going to be some drilling and some grinding. Essentially what we're going to need to do is grind out a lot of these openings. So the easiest way to figure out which ones you need to do is just look at the fender side by side once you get that hardware off and figure out which ones you need to open up. So a lot of these things are already pre-provisioned. All you got to do is take a Dremel with a routing bit and just open these all up. A lot of these are just so you can flip a clip in here so that you can bolt the hardware to here, but it is very simple. Again, you're gonna have to do the same thing down here. There's a bunch of holes. So as far as tools that make this a hell of a lot easier, get yourself some step bits. Step bits were basically made for doing stuff like this. It gives you a lot of control over the diameter of the hole, and you're gonna need to get right in the center and just slowly open that up. And you can measure the step bit size by going into an existing hole or going in the hole on the factory fender and figuring out what size you need. Then, like I said, Dremel with a routing bit, because once you open up these squares, you're gonna need a route along the edge here. You wanna make sure that the opening is the exact same size as the factory. Not horribly complicated, just take your time. It is fiberglass though, it's gonna get everywhere, so have a vacuum ready to go. So what I'm gonna do is go ahead and start cutting all these holes. And again, the easiest way to know which holes you need to cut is just look at this fender, look at your factory one. Wherever there's holes on the factory one that aren't holes on here, that's where you gotta cut. You're not guessing on a lot of the locations, so if there is not a hole drilled, there is at least the provisions so you see where the hole needs to go. So they at least make that part easier. But again, you just gotta do a little bit of trimming. There's no real modifications, just opening up these holes and getting all that hardware switched over. So let's go ahead and do that. But again, everything's so super easy so far. No cutting, no drilling, no welding, nothing, no modifications needed. Everything at this point has been basically unbolting it and getting it off the vehicle. Vehicle looks a little naked, but it's gonna look good here in a few minutes. All right, now that we have all of our holes drilled, got all those square provisions cut out for that sensor, you can go ahead and reinstall all the speed nuts on the carbon fiber fender. So there are two that go here for the main sensor there. There's one that goes down low, and then there's another one inside the fender flare, which is where inside the fender where the flare attaches to. Last thing I will say is this is one that I forgot about on the driver's side, but there is also one hole that needs to be drilled out on the inside of the fender. This is the alignment for the headlights. This is a lot easier to do once the fender's on the truck. It just gives you a better angle at it, and it's kind of a fragile piece. So we can now take the fender and install it on the truck. So best way to do this is to get your hardware ready to go. And the first ones you want to do are these top ones. You don't want to tighten everything down. Essentially what you want to do is go off of this corner right here, make sure your seam is flat, tighten everything down here, and just kind of work your way forward. Because what I ended up having to do is I had to push the top of the fender in on the driver's side, and then I had to pull the front portion of it out so it lined with the hood here. So anyway, it's as simple as reinstalling everything now at this point, provided you went ahead and drilled out all the holes that you needed to on your fender. Double check everything, make sure whatever hole you found on your factory one is on the carbon fiber one. That way when you're holding this up into place, it's not big and bulky and you're struggling because you forgot to drill out a hole. I did that on the driver's side. It's not fun. Anyway, now at this point, we're gonna go ahead and reinstall the fender on the truck. And like I said, we're gonna work our way from this top left corner and work our way that way. We'll leave that bolt for last. That's not really an adjustable one. What we want to do is make sure we have a nice clean gap here, a nice clean gap against the hood. So we're going to be lowering the hood a little bit just to double check everything. But it's very simple now. Just go ahead and reinstall now that you got your holes drilled. I guess the one thing I did forget to do is we're going to go ahead and install this grill fender little pocket here, this little vent in the fender before we get it on the truck. It's very easy, just like the hood. It's just little studs and then a washer and nut. And there's 3 of them. They pop right into place. Looks nice. So we're gonna go ahead and do this before we get this guy thrown up on the truck. All right, so the fender is roughed into place. All the screws are installed, but they're just loose right now, giving me some movement really in the fender. So now we play the alignment game. So like I said, the first thing I do is I start up in this top corner, and what I wanna see is a nice clean line here. I also wanna see a nice consistent line all the way down between this and the door. So really, this will dictate, the top will dictate the size of that gap, and then what you can do is pull the bottom out a little bit to adjust that gap to make sure it's the same all the way up. Once it's all the way up and installed, then you can go ahead and tighten that 8mm here. You could tighten down this 10mm up here. Then your top left corner is good. Then what we could do is go around, go down to the bottom, mess with those two 10mm. Like I said, you could pull the fender out a little bit. There's a lot of leeway down there. Then we'll start to close our hood and we'll figure out how good our gap is here, because what we might end up having to do is pull the top portion of the fender out like I did over there and then push this side in to make sure everything's aligned. You have 3 bolts here, so the easiest way to do that is close your hood, figure out where it's at, tighten that guy down, then close your hood again, tighten this guy down, do the middle one last. The other thing outside of alignment, the other thing we need to do is go grab this little bumper piece. I totally forgot to grab that. So this guy goes on, let's see, goes like this. So now we're good. Anyway, that's how I start to align. So you can start up in the top left corner and kind of work your way forward. You want to align this edge, door edge, and then hood. Everything else kind of falls into place. I did it that way on the driver's side, and you can see once the headlight's in, everything does look nice and clean. Again, this is a super easy project so long as you take time. This is taking me 2 days. I'm doing this by myself. I didn't realize I'd have to be doing any cutting. That's why it took me longer than expected, but the cutting is not horrible. I was able to knock this guy out in probably an hour and a half, whereas that guy took me about 3 hours just to figure out everything, and that's kind of how things go. So hopefully my video helps you move forward faster on your fender replacement project. All right, everything is tightened down. Now, one thing to note when you're tightening down carbon fiber panels, you don't need to go crazy tight. Treat it like an ABS plastic. If you go too tight, you're going to end up cracking things. Just tight enough to hold everything in place. So like I said, start in that top left corner, work your way down, make sure you have a nice even gap this way, and then work your way this way. Lower the hood, tighten up this guy to get that nice gap here. Leave the middle bolt undone, tighten this guy last. That way you could angle things and make sure that this line is nice and even with the hood. So the last bolt I did on the fender was this guy up front. I just poked them out just a smidge just to account for that carbon fiber lower grill trim, because it is a little bit wider than the factory one. So we're good at this point. Now all we need to do is just start going back in and reassembling everything. Make sure when you put your fender on, you do plug all your sensors back in. So we had to unplug this sensor, and then we have our marker light here once we install our fender flare. So the next thing we're gonna do is reinstall the splash guard, and then from there we'll do our headlight. Oh, all right, one last thing we need to do before we reinstall everything is I was mentioning that there's a headlight alignment pin here. So you can see there's an oval opening. It's not open yet, but we're gonna take our little Dremel and open this guy up. That way we could pull this little white clip off of our factory fender, and then this is gonna pop right in there. So this is what aligns the headlight inside the opening. I forgot to do this on the driver's side and it didn't work out well. So that pin's basically just gonna go there. So let's just use our router bit to open that guy up, pop that in there, and then we can start to reassembling everything. So catch you back in a few minutes once we have a little bit more parts on here and we can catch up on the build. All right, we have our headlight locator little clip there installed, so we're good there. Fender is all tightened down. Now we can go ahead and install the wheel well liner. There's a couple things that make this a lot easier. One, there's a little hump here. That hump will line up with this pin here. So if you hook it on the backside, it'll help you hang the liner in there. And then this section right here is what lines up with this piece of the fender. Once you get those two lined up, everything else just kind of falls in place, and we can go put our 8mm bolts around the outside as well as those 3 push pins from there. So from here, fender's installed. And that was really the whole primary intent of the video, is to show you how to install this fender. I'm going to go ahead and reinstall everything. We'll take a look at the final fitment on everything, how it looks once everything's put back together. But if you have any questions on how to install that fender or any other modifications I had to make that thing work, which wasn't a lot, definitely leave them down in the comments below and I will answer those. But so far, I'm super stoked with how both sides have gone on. Very minimal modifications need to be made, just a couple things as far as fitting sensors and whatnot. All right, the EOS fender project is done. Everything is looking great. So I was able to maintain really nice and consistent lines between the fender and the hood, as well as the fender and the door. Everything's a little dirty right now. I'm gonna give everything a nice wash tomorrow before we go on our road trip, but I wanted to finish up everything and I just really quickly wiped it down. So not as glossy as it will be once I give it a nice little polish and some sealant on it. Fender fits great with the headlights, with the lower grille trim, with the fender flares. There's no issue putting any of the OEM parts back on with the aftermarket fender. So kudos to the EOS team. Also, the lines were great. I've seen a lot of other brands where the aftermarket ones couldn't really get this line to match perfectly, so they can't get this angle on the door. These look awesome. So Passenger side's on, driver side's on. Got the carbon fiber hood, carbon fiber lower grille. Now the next thing in the pipeline is definitely going to be carbon fiber fender flares for the front and the rear. So we're going to put a little carbon on the back there. I absolutely love the way this truck is turning out. Again, all these parts so far have gone on without any sort of issues whatsoever. 100% bolt on, with the exception of some drilling for the fenders themselves. It really was a 100% bolt on project. With that said, I will leave all the instructions down below in a shared drive file so that you have it, and that's the grill removal, the lower grill removal, headlight removal, as well as the wheel well liner. All of that's needed to swap out your fenders if you're going with the EOS carbon fiber ones, or if you're just following this video because you want to replace your OEM ones with new OEM ones. Anyway, with that said, thank you very much for watching. Appreciate it. Any questions, comments, leave them down in the comments below. See you in the next video. Bye.